Welcome to this meeting on Nutrition for Growth, 1 year on. My name is Jeff Vaga. I'm the director of the London International Development Centre and the technical advisor to the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. And I'll be your master of ceremonies this evening. It's great to see such a great turnout on such a nice day. We don't get many of those, and this is one of our first really nice ones in a work week. So delighted to see you all. And I'd like to particularly welcome those who've come from around the world to the Alcira Conference on Agri-Food Policy and Governance for Nutrition and Health, which starts tomorrow. I'm very pleased to have such an international constituency in our meeting tonight. And welcome to all of you others from London and elsewhere. 1 year ago, more than 100 stakeholders signed the Global Nutrition for Growth Compact and collectively committed to reduce the number of stunted children by 20 million, saving a predicted 1.7 million lives through reaching 500 million women and children with effective nutrition interventions. To achieve these ambitious targets, those stakeholders committed £2 billion in nutrition-specific interventions and an additional £11 billion in nutrition-sensitive interventions in relevant sectors such as agriculture and social protection. Today we have a group of distinguished speakers who will update us on progress since that event in June in London last year. And more importantly, they will look forward with us to what more needs to be done and what they will be doing to meet this challenge. So let me give you a picture of what we'll be doing this evening. First, we're going to have 3 short presentations from invited speakers. One to set the scene on the issue around nutrition and growth. A second to describe a specific initiative started last year, the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. And a third speaker to talk about the Global Nutrition Report, another product from the Nutrition for Growth event, which is well underway. Then we'll be inviting a panel of experts from government, international, and civil society sectors to hear what they've been doing in this past year and their ideas in the future. Then we'll have a presentation from the government of Brazil, who've been very much involved in this process and who will take up the baton on nutrition for growth at the 2016 Olympics. And finally, we're going to have a chance for you to ask questions of that group for as much time as is left over after the presentations up to 7 o'clock, when we will retire downstairs for refreshments and less formal discussions. So that's the plan for this evening. And I'm very grateful that we've got so many excellent speakers. We do have a lot of excellent speakers, so I'm also going to be grateful to them for keeping their presentations pithy and short, as I hope the audience will do as well in their questions. So I'll be trying to keep some time on that, so please work with me. Now, this event is being live streamed. Twitter lines are open now, and we'll be recording it to appear on the website of the Global Panel and the London International Development Centre, and we'll be taking questions through Twitter as well. So to our Twitter audience, please listen carefully and come up with questions and send them in, and we'll do what we can to answer questions from both audiences here and there. So let me begin, without further ado, by inviting our first speaker this evening. Professor Srinath Reddy is president of the Public Health Foundation of India. He has many other roles, but his significant roles for this evening are that he's a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, and he's a co-chair of the independent expert group preparing the Global Nutrition Report. Srinath will set for us tonight the scene on why nutrition is of key importance today and what we should be doing about it. Srinath.
Thank you, and good evening. We meet in 2014, which is pivotally positioned between 2 years of 2014, which is pivotally positioned between 2 years of great significance for global health. In 2013, a UN-led review of the Millennium Development Goals concluded that there was inadequate progress, and therefore there needed to be much greater acceleration of the momentum for attaining those goals. In the same year, the World Health Assembly adopted the Global Plan of Action for the Prevention and Control of Non-Communicable Diseases. Next year, in 2015, the United Nations, through the Sustainable Development Goals, will be attempting to blend both of these agendas of the Millennium Development Goals as well as the NCDs into one single health goal. The common underpinning for both of these is the area of nutrition, which clearly contributes to much of the global burden of disease, whether it's because of the consequences of undernutrition or the impact on chronic non-communicable diseases. Clearly, in terms of undernutrition, which was the primary reason why the last year's conference was held and the commitments were made, it continues to remain a challenge to global conscience in terms of the numbers of children who are impacted, and particularly in terms of the glaring health inequity that it imposes upon several regions of the world which continue to battle underdevelopment. About 870 million persons were estimated by the Food and Agriculture Organization to be hungry or undernourished in 2010-2012 based on protein energy malnutrition. Undernutrition is responsible for 35% of all deaths in children under 5 years of age. About 8,000 children die every day because of undernutrition, a fact that the world cannot contend with as it evolves in the 21st century. Undernutrition accounts for about 11% of the global disease burden. It also reduces schooling attainment. We frequently talk in terms of deaths, but the morbidity and the loss of cognitive power, the wastage of brain power, is also an important developmental impediment. And this is something, again, that we must contend with. In democratic societies, we talk of equality of opportunity in terms of education and employment. But if we blight these brains within the first 5 years of life because of poor nutrition, certainly we are not providing that equality of opportunity. And as the 20th century British economist Tony said, what we need is not just an open road, but an equal start, and that can only come from good nutrition. In terms of the long shadow that undernutrition also throws in later life on vulnerability to non-communicable diseases, again, we now know that diabetes and cardiovascular disease and some cancers are epigenetically determined by undernutrition in utero as well as in early childhood. And therefore, we also have to look at what nutrition does to NCDs through undernutrition. But even independently thereof, we know that nutrition is a major threat by causing the other form of malnutrition, that is inappropriate nutrition, which leads to cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity. About 65% of the global mortality is now attributed to non-communicable diseases. About a quarter of the 36 million deaths that occur every year due to non-communicable diseases occur below the age of 60 years. And 90% of those premature deaths occur in low and middle income countries, again, threatening development. We know that the poor are vulnerable, both in terms of their susceptibility to NCDs, in terms of denial of services because of poverty being an impediment to health care, but also that NCDs unattended can also launch them into poverty and aggravate poverty. And catastrophic health expenditure is an important consequence, as we found out that 73% of persons with a cardiovascular event in Kerala in India had catastrophic health expenditure, and 50% had to resort to distress financing. At the same time, obesity also is threatening the world, with an estimated 1 billion persons overweight in the world and an additional 475 million obese. About 200 million school children are now overweight, of whom 40 to 50 million are obese. Again, the World Health Organization has just launched a global commission on ending childhood obesity, which again tells us that nutrition has to be looked at in multiple dimensions. Very clearly, what is needed is a life course approach to nutrition. We cannot talk in terms of child mortality or maternal mortality without considering the health of the anemic adolescent girl. And therefore, again, we cannot fragment health systems and segment health into different age groups, but we have to take a life course approach. And therefore, we have to look at how agriculture and food systems can support healthy nutrition across the lifespan. And again, we have to recognize that policies are vital for this because individual choice is only limited. Choice can be conscious based on either adequate information or incorrect information. It can be conditioned by marketing or peer pressure, or it can be constrained by poverty and lack of access. And therefore, we have to recognize that we have to have policy-level interventions in order to shape nutrition across the lifespan. Therefore, agriculture and food systems should align with global and national nutrition goals to ensure that every person has access to calorically adequate and nutritionally appropriate diets which are affordable at each stage of life. Agriculture, food systems, and nutrition and health are also closely linked to environment, and therefore, we have to examine it in the context of sustainable development as well. We are currently living in a society where food systems are degrading the environment, and environmental degradation due to multiple causes is threatening agriculture and nutrition. We cannot continue that way. We recognize that agriculture, health, and nutrition are not only integrally related, but they're also key to human development. Robert Fogel, the Nobel laureate economist, determined that 50% of the improved economic growth in Britain during 1790 to 1980 was due to improved nutrition, due to social policies initiated during 1790 to 1930. The rest of the world should benefit from similar sort of policies. We therefore need agriculture and food systems that are biologically nourishing, ecologically sustainable, and economically equitable. And we do know what the counterfactual is, that if we ignore this, what's likely to happen in terms of escalating non-communicable diseases and continued threat of undernutrition in children. Never before in human history have we been so forewarned about what would happen if we neglect our tasks. But never before in human history have we been so forearmed with the knowledge to change it. It's a challenge to human intellect and enterprise that we apply that knowledge appropriately, and that's why the global panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinath, for starting us off so well. I'm now going to turn to Sir John Beddington, the Professor of Natural Resources Management at the Oxford Martin School, former UK Government Chief Science Advisor, and particularly in this evening's context, co-chair of the Global Panel. John, I invite you to share your thoughts with us on that.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Srinath, thank you for a very inspiring speech. One of the sort of horrors of being the government chief scientist was that I was constantly called upon to go to and speak to audiences who all knew vastly more about the subject area than I did, and that is certainly the case now, as Srinath has, I think, so eloquently shown. I had thought a bit about how I would characterize what we're doing here in the global panel, but I think it's fair to say that the problems that Srinath has outlined are formidable. But I think they're formidable actually also, and they're underestimated, because we are living in a dramatically changing world. Simple population growth would add something of the order of 1 billion people in the next 14 years. Changes in living habits and migration from the rural hinterland into cities will mean that something of the order of 60% of the world's population, vastly more in some countries like Brazil, are going to be living in urban environments. And there's a degree, in a sense this is good, there's a degree of prosperity, but that has actually generated enormous problems because the simple statistics, and beware spurious accuracy, but there is going to be massive shortages of water, of food. There's going to be real problems of demographic change. And, as if that wasn't enough, climate change is happening, despite some of the nonsense that you actually read about. And that climate change is happening, and it's inexorable. Because of the time delays in the system, what you're seeing is that essentially the weather, which is not too nice at the moment in the worldwide is dependent on the greenhouse gases that were in the atmosphere in the 1990s. And things have not improved vastly since then, because there's a 20-year timeline. So the horrible human problems that Srinath has outlined in terms of problems of obesity, overweight, malnutrition, the problems of childhood, the stunting, the human catastrophe that is involved, are actually being faced in a context where things are actually going to get much worse. And they are going to get much worse. How are you going to deal with another 500 million people in Africa, primarily living in the urban environment, in 10 years' time? Or the 500 million in Asia, also in the urban environments? So these are, this is not to me bring you a great tale of woe, but it's saying this is not easy. And one of the reasons I was sort of delighted to be asked to be involved in this panel, which is not just the fact that I'm privileged to sort of share the chairing of it with John Kafur, a man who I've admired for very long, but also having a really splendid panel to actually try to address these problems and put it in the context, because so many of the aims of the agricultural systems at good things like, trying to minimize water use, trying to minimize the production of greenhouse gases, or indeed just to increase yields. All of those could be badly confused and actually could have detrimental effects on the issue of nutrition. So it is really important, because these things are not going to be easy. Now, the panel, we met for the first time in October last year, and I think we launched it in this slightly frightening lecture theatre. I say frightening because I came in from the back, and the rake of this I found rather confusing. I don't suffer from vertigo, but just as well, I thought, when I came in. But the panel has started. We had our first meeting, and there's quite a bit that's gone on since. But I think one of the things that I'd say is that in terms of the basic objectives of the panel, and this is my own sort of belief, is it really has got to be evidence-based. And I know Lawrence is going to be talking about the sort of major review that he's going to be involved in. Lawrence, I couldn't find you. I thought for a moment you might be sat where the speakers were, but no, your characteristic modesty shines again. And we want to generate, the evidence base for this is not particularly good, as Lawrence's review will surely show, but it also needs to be focusing into the food system. So part of the job, and Jeff is chairing the Secretariat, is trying to actually bring the evidence base to think about how the agricultural system can actually promote nutrition at the same time as addressing the complex of problems that are out there. So that's one of the things. The second thing is more sort of, it's the sort of thing that you do in Whitehall, you sort of wave hands and say we want to improve understanding, which is fine, but actually what you want to do is to pose problems and actually say these might be reasonable solutions if political decisions could be taken. And we want to, and part of the panel, and because of the senior political level of many of the people who are attending on the panel, we do have a chance to actually get some real input at the very highest level. And I think that those of you who have had the chance to see it, we do have, and we have a great example in Srinath, a panel that is able to actually deal at very, very high levels, both in terms of the science, the evidence, and the way the interventions can be done in a politically feasible and practically feasible way with, for example, the both industry and government. And we've done a few things, because it's all very well to sort of pontificate on and say this is what we're doing and what we're planning to do. We've been running for rather less than a year now, and there's 2 or 3 things that I'd probably draw to your attention. We engaged with the Comprehensive African Agriculture Initiative with this in the Year of Agriculture in Africa, and Jeff leading the Secretariat has engaged there. We're looking at biofortification, because that's a fundamentally difficult issue, quite fraught in some instances with some NGOs who are communities who, for example, are fundamentally against biotechnology interventions involving genetic manipulation for biofortification and alternatives. And the meeting in Kigali in March, I think it was, the panel's already engaged with that. And I think that there have been some meetings both in Washington and Addis looking at gaps in this area, because gaps, the evidence gaps, the policy gaps need to be addressed. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing to work with the panel I feel rather inadequate for this task, because the task is completely formidable. And the pledges of significant sums of money are very important. But actually, I think it's a reasonable question to say, are they sufficient to actually address what is probably, as Srinath has said, one of the most important problems of humanity over the next few years? One of the things that one of my close friends said, the problem with John Beddington giving speeches is that you all tend to get so miserable you're desperate for a drink afterwards. I hope that is not the case. I wanted to raise to you the issue that this is so important. And I think that because I have a faith, I really believe that human ingenuity is the way to address these problems, whether that is human ingenuity in terms of agricultural science and engineering, whether it is human intervention in terms of more sophisticated, more sensible, more tailored social and economic systems, or whether it's human ingenuity and one looks to our political masters to actually think of smarter ways of doing this. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. Drinks are coming, but not for a while. Our final speaker in this section is Professor Lawrence Haddad, Senior Research Fellow of the International Food Policy Research Institute, former Director of the Institute of Development Studies here in UK, and particularly in this evening's context, co-chair of the Independent Expert Group for the Global Nutrition Report. So I invite you, Lawrence, to tell us about that project and how it's progressing.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Srinath. I really like the forewarned and forearmed. I'm going to use that shamelessly in the future. And John, where's John? People, that modesty comment. I made that. I made a comment to one of my former bosses. It's not you, Perry. Don't worry. One of my former bosses, I said, he's really modest, and the former boss said he's got a lot to be modest about. So I'm always worried when people say that about me. I've got 5 minutes and 5 points. So my first point is, what is this global report all about? What is it about? It's about let me just tell you the pragmatic mechanics of it. There's a stakeholder group co-chaired by the UK and the government of Malawi. That stakeholder group has about 20-25 people on it. They set the broad strategic directions for the report, but the quality of the report, the relevance of the report, the timeliness of the report, coming in on budget of the report is entirely down to the independent expert group that Srinath and I co-chair, and some of that group is in the audience tonight. You've been going for less than a year. We've been going for less than a month, and we're knackered, to tell you the truth. Oh, this is being live streamed. I have to watch myself. We're tired. We just come back. We had our first meeting today. It was a lively meeting. We're trying to develop a report which was called for a year ago at the Nutrition for Growth event. The report is global, so it's not just about undernutrition. It's not just about Africa and South Asia. It's about all countries. It's annual. It's not every 2 years or every 3 years. It's annual. And it is comprehensive. So it's going to be trying to look at not just undernutrition, but also overnutrition, not just outcomes, but programs, not just programs, but resources, legislation, policies, a whole bunch of things. We are probably going to miss the mark on lots of our ambitions in 2014, but hopefully we will build to 2015 and 2016. So we're very excited. Our job is to add value to the fabulous work that UNICEF and WHO and SUN and a whole range of other people are doing. 2, what are we hoping to actually achieve through this? Well, our first report will be launched at the ICN in November in Rome. We're hoping to achieve, I think, 5 things. First thing, we're trying to monitor progress, obviously. We're trying to monitor progress on all the things that we talked about at the country level, at the global level, and at the stakeholder level. We're trying to identify bottlenecks in ideas, in implementation, in financing, in action. We're trying to not name and shame, but we're going to try to identify those bottlenecks and suggest ways forward, suggest approaches that might work to relieve those bottlenecks. 3, we're going to talk about the quality, the state of the data in nutrition. The high-level panel that Michael and others were involved in talked about a data revolution. Well, it hasn't come to nutrition yet, and we want to use our report to help encourage those who can make decisions to improve the quality of data, invest in it. 4th, we want to position nutrition in the post-MDG framework. The MDGs are all about accountability, and the SDGs, or whatever they're called, will also be all about accountability. So if this report, which is not about accountability, doesn't say something about that, we're in big trouble and we've failed. So we're going to be trying to enter various political processes backed by evidence to say this is how we think nutrition should be best positioned. And ultimately, what we're hoping to do is contribute to an acceleration in the reduction of malnutrition. I'll come back to this point later on. Point 3, progress. So UNICEF, WHO, and the World Bank have kindly made some of the data available from the WHO, the World Health Assembly report that they've just launched, and we've been having a look at it. And it's quite you can think of it as depressing, not depressing. I think it's a bit depressing, to tell you the truth. We've only just had a look at it for a couple of days, but for the 84 countries that have comparable baseline data for this 2010 to 2025 period, and for the 4 of the 6 WHA indicators that we have the best data for, so for the 4 indicators for the baseline period for comparable data, only 2 of those 84 countries are on track for all 4 of those indicators. 13 are on track for 3 of those indicators. Now, those numbers may change as we do some more work on the data, but I wanted to share those with you right now. Point number 4, data. We don't have as much data as we think we do, and yet we've got a lot of data. How can those two things be reconciled? Well, again, if you think there are 150 countries that are not rich countries, not high-income countries in the world, of those 150 countries, we've only got data for 84 of those countries for the WHA data for all 4 of those indicators I mentioned to you. Remember I said of the 84, only so many are meeting the targets for all 4 indicators? Well, there's more than 84 countries in the world. There's 195. You take out the 45 or so high-income countries, and we've only got 84 of the 150 who actually even have data, comparable baseline data for the 4 indicators that I mentioned: overweight, stunting, wasting, and exclusive breastfeeding. So that's pretty feeble, and this is not a criticism of those who collect and compile this data. In fact, when I've been meeting with colleagues who are responsible for collecting and compiling and cleaning and organizing the data so that the rest of us can use them, I've been appalled at what a shoestring they've got to operate on. And it's really a scandal how little is actually invested in data collection for nutrition. That's an absolute scandal. And there can't be a data revolution without someone paying for it. So those of you who have your fingers on the purse strings, pay for more nutrition data. It's a threadbare state. And my final point is on targets. Again, we've got about 162, let me just focus on stunting. We've got about 162 million kids under the age of 5 who are stunted. The target is to get to 100 million by, is it 2025 or 2030? 2025? So this is not a test. This is not a trick question. It's 2025. Current projections suggest we will be well short of that on business as usual. Well short of that. Something in the region of 135 to 125. I don't think our targets are ambitious enough. I'm glad that the World Health Assembly has a target of 100 million, but I don't think that's ambitious enough. This is a personal view, not a global report view. Why do I think that they're not ambitious enough? Consider, we've got economic growth recovering all over the world. And we know economic growth is really important for stunting reduction. For every 10% increase in economic growth, we get a 5% or 6% decrease in stunting rates. 2, we've got a lot of momentum globally and at the national level. Sun has a lot to do with that. The Lancet has a lot to do with that. The food price crisis has a lot to do with that. Every one of you in the room has a lot to do with that. Third, spending can only go up. I mean, it's really low right now. $500 million a year, this is an ODA, $500 million a year spent on nutrition specific. $4 billion a year spent on nutrition sensitive. That leaves about $96 billion that's spent on other things that could be spent on nutrition. Why do I say that could be spent on nutrition? 45% of all under 5 deaths we know are attributable to malnutrition. Something's not wrong with that picture. The evidence base has never been stronger. It's not perfect. There's lots of things we'd like to know how to do, but we can't. And then there's India. If you look at the data from Maharashtra has reduced its stunting rate from something like 36% to 24% in a 6-year period. That's astonishing. We looked at those data, and they really stack up. If you something even remotely close to that across the rest of India, because Maharashtra is not really that special in terms of the conditions, something even remotely close to that in India, you'd go from 65 million stunted kids to maybe 45 million stunted kids overnight. And that survey's in the field right now. That's 20 million off that 162 million target. So I think we can do a lot better than that. Our colleagues in hunger and in poverty are talking about zero poverty and zero hunger. Why not zero malnutrition? Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Well, there you have 2 initiatives begun last year around the Nutrition for Growth event and the progress that they're making. And I think that's quite an impressive bit of information that we've just been given. An opportunity to get some data together to make the case even stronger. So we now move to the next part of our evening, which is a discussion with 6 experts whose institutions have been busy addressing challenges of undernutrition and malnutrition. And they've all agreed to give us short, sharp updates of where their institutions and sectors are in that progress since last year. And they've agreed also to answer questions in the session that follows. So I'm going to ask them all up to the stage here. Not in any particular order, but I'll tell you who they are. So please, could our panelists please come up? We've got some microphones there, which they can all share in presentations. Our panelists include Arti Ahuja, the head of Department of Women and Child Development in Odisha State in India. Elizabeth Kimani, who's an associate research scientist at the African Population Health Research Council in Nairobi. Nick Dyer, who's a Director General for Policy and Global Programs at DFID. Joe Cerrell, the Managing Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation. Michael Anderson, the Chief Executive Officer of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and Tom Arnold, who is Concern Worldwide's Special Representative for Hunger. So thank you for all coming. And I'm going to start the panel comments with the donors who've made these commitments a year ago and ask them each to tell us a bit about where they're at and where they're going with that. So we'll just have that series of presentations and then the questions will come later. So, Nick, can I begin with you? Have you got a microphone? Great. You're DFID's Director General for Policy and Global Programs. Last year, DFID committed to triple its investment in nutrition up to 2020, and you made a strong case then for the role of business in tackling undernutrition as well. How are you getting on with these commitments, and what are your priorities for the coming year?
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks very much for Srinath, particularly for laying out and John for laying out the challenge, which is exactly the reason why we did the event last year. And from a personal perspective, for somebody who's been working in international development for 25 years, it's only the last 4 or 5 that really we've been, certainly in DFID, addressing nutrition. And that just shows, it's just an illustration about how much of a sort of orphan this has been for many years, which I think is why, from our perspective, the event last year was A, so important, B, to some extent a success. Now, why do I say to some extent a success? Because if you go to places like Zambia, which I did in December last year, it's quite clear that here we have a country that is growing rapidly, is now lower middle income status, but still has 45% of its children stunted. And this is hard, and the reality is that this is going to require a long-term effort to make a difference and to sustain the momentum. So how are we getting on? I could give you a long list of all the programs that we started afresh. So we've started 9 new programs on nutrition. I could tell you all about the business engagement we've been doing. But let me tell you the 3 things I think we need going forward to sustain the momentum. So 3 things we need: advocacy, delivery, and accountability. So in terms of advocacy, last week I was in Toronto dealing in an event on maternal and child deaths. And the good thing about that event was it's talked about the importance of nutrition. This is starting to get traction, but we need to continue in terms of getting engaged and integrated into the post-MDGs. We need to get the ICN2 to be a success next year. And we are absolutely delighted to be working with the Brazilian government, who we'll hear from later, in terms of taking forward this agenda into the Rio Olympics in 2 years' time. Advocacy, delivery, we've got to show that we can change the facts on the ground. If we can't change the facts on the ground, we're actually not going to sustain the support for this agenda. And thirdly, in terms of accountability, I think, Lawrence, your report is terrific. It may be difficult, we may not have the right data, but this has got to be the starting point. We've got to actually show and highlight what the challenges are and bring them to life, and actually tell the political leaders and show the political leaders what the challenge is, because until we do that, then they're not going to take this agenda seriously. And until they do that, they're not going to actually invest in terms of their own domestic resources, in terms of putting it into nutrition. So advocacy, delivery, accountability. If we get those 3 right, we're going to sustain this momentum.
Thank you, Nick. Michael, as the new CEO of CIFF, and with your earlier experience as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on the post-2015 development agenda, what do you feel are the key challenges and opportunities ahead for achieving nutrition targets and commitments, and what role do you see CIFF playing in that?
Thanks, Jeff. Actually, a pretty soft question. You could have asked a much harder one, so thank you. Look, I think that there are 4 things, which I just want to highlight quickly. I agree with the challenge laid out by Lawrence, which I thought was incredibly compelling, and I agree also with the main points Nick's just made. But so 4 simple points. One of them is increasing the amount of money that goes to nutrition is going to be a necessary but not sufficient condition. We know that's important, but we need to do things that are not entirely new. We can work more diagonally and in more cross-sectoral ways, so using antenatal care platforms to deliver iron and folic acid supplements to pregnant women, for example, isn't happening enough. We're not doing enough to use community health workers and agriculture extension workers to help screen for severe acute malnutrition, for example. So I think there are a lot of things where we can take advantage of existing delivery platforms. That's one thing. I think we need to be smarter about that. The second thing we know, which has already been mentioned, senior level commitment really matters, but not just for politicians, but for officials and for business leaders. I think there's some terrific examples. Rwanda's national emergency plan to eliminate malnutrition. Of course, people say, well, it would be Rwanda, wouldn't it? But it has been an amazing success, a lot more to go. But the multi-sectoral coordination across ministries has seen stunting rates cut by almost 10% in 5 years, which is a really impressive achievement. On the senior commitment, I think there's a key message that this audience and the global panel have to help get out, which is in March in Abuja, I was talking to a group of ministers, mainly finance ministers from the African Union, and every time I mentioned nutrition as a problem, they all had one answer, which is food. And kind of the simple idea that enough to eat, solves nutrition by itself is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have to overcome. And Srinath and John and others, I'm looking to you to help make sure that that message is challenged. Because as long as people, senior leaders, are able to think that growing more maize is going to do it by itself, we're not going to get there. And that is a very widespread view. My third point, very briefly, is innovation is important. I believe in innovation. CIFF is going to invest in innovation. But there is a risk that innovation is overrated. And there's a risk that what's underrated is just execution, execution, execution. Get on with it. Much of what needs to be done is not rocket science. Lawrence has already mentioned the terrific example of Maharashtra. Maharashtra did nothing that was hugely innovative. It just got down and paid attention to management and delivered. My last point, others have talked about, but accountability and measurement and data. Really do think this is going to be the thing which is going to help drive ownership, it's going to help drive execution, it's going to help drive the cross-platform delivery. Really pleased that Lawrence and others are working on this, but it's a big contribution to make. So I'll stop at that, Jeff.
Thanks, Michael. Joe, last year the Gates Foundation committed $800 million in nutrition-related activities, particularly in breastfeeding, I think, and scientific research. Could you update us on where you are with that and where you're going next year?
Yeah, and thanks to you for hosting this great event, along with DFID, CIFF, and the Brazilian Embassy. The Gates Foundation made a commitment last year, $862.7 million, of which a big portion of that was to nutrition-specific, but also nutrition-sensitive programs. And I think for us, we have ourselves been much more committed to thinking about what are the ways we can better integrate nutrition into some of our health and agriculture programs. Those are two areas where we had a lot more activity going, and this was a very good galvanizing moment for us to also take stock on ways that we can sensitize ourselves to really incorporating nutrition into the way that we work. As Bill Gates said, in the first 1,000 days of life, it's so critical to make sure that you address some of the nutrition-related needs of children, that no matter the interventions that you provide, whether in education or in health, if you miss that first 1,000 days, you really lost the potential of that child from achieving their full capacity. So we see it as increasingly a much more important part of the way that we're thinking about some of our health and our agriculture work. Towards that commitment, we've started to ramp up from our 2012 spending, indicates $115 million in new spending on nutrition, 80 million of which is to nutrition-specific interventions, and the rest towards nutrition-sensitive. And so we are seeing already an upward trajectory, and are very confident in the 2013 spending. When those numbers become available, you'll see that increasingly that we're making progress, and very confident we'll achieve the 2020 objectives that we've set for ourselves. We've seen some remarkable progress. One effort that my colleagues were very eager to call out is Alive and Thrive, a $20 million investment that we made over the last 5 years, where we're seeing dramatic progress in a relatively short period of time. Between 2009 and 2014, Alive and Thrive has reached more than 16 million children under the age of 2 in countries including Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, with a tripling in Vietnam of children reach on exclusive breastfeeding and improved complementary feeding practices. So we've chosen to extend a second phase of that program. We're very excited about that. But I would say that for us, moments like this are incredibly important and not to be underestimated. When the world can really come together and put an issue like nutrition on the map. I mean, CIFF in particular and DFID are to be commended. I mean, really hats off to both for really driving this agenda forward, getting donors like us to go through the process of thinking how sensitive are we to nutrition within our own programs. And really it's a helpful exercise, even though sometimes they're often very painstaking in going through, that really does galvanize the community and galvanizes the conversations and dialogues needed. So I'd say, to sum it up, for us, integration is going to be key in the future. we haven't done as good a job, I would say, at the Gates Foundation, really incorporating agriculture and nutrition. Now they're part of the same program in global development for us. They sit very close to one another. They talk a lot more, and it seems like a no-brainer. But for us, it took a while, and I think this effort has been really helpful in us to better integrate ag nutrition and increasingly other health priorities into a common continuum. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Tom, can I turn to you? As Concerned Worldwide's Special Representative for Hunger, you also have a strong impression of civil society commitment to nutrition goals. So could you share some thoughts on how you feel civil society is getting on with the commitments they made, and how the UK NGO community, which made such a contribution to Nutrition for Growth last year, is forging a global network for action?
Okay, I'm certainly glad to do that, but I think that it's the wider context, a brief word on first. What Lawrence said about momentum here is of critical importance, because we have momentum now for the variety of reasons that he says. It has to be sustained and built upon. The two things we heard about earlier, the global panel and the global report, each can make an important contribution to building that momentum. I have to say, in an audience like this, backing up what Joe said, British government's leadership role here over the past number of years has been absolutely vital, and I hope it continues, as the same comment applies for DFID. It has been absolutely crucial. Now, when we get specifically to civil society, one of the big parts of this momentum in the past few years is the SUN movement. We now have over 50 countries signed up to the SUN from a standing start in 2010. And within the SUN, the critically important factor of the role of civil society. There is a civil society network as part of the SUN. It was established, its inaugural meeting took place in Washington on the 11th of June last year, just 3 days after the meeting here. And now there are 800 civil societies make up that network. So it's an impressive body of people. And the key purpose of this, is to encourage the alignment of civil society organizations, strategies, programs and resources with the country plans for scaling up nutrition. And that's of really major importance. And the building of civil society alliances in these countries is also important. And last year, the number of civil society alliances have risen from 11 to 30. So that means almost half of over 60% of SUN countries have civil society alliances. We're also beginning to see twinning, sharing of experiences between different countries of what's happening under SUN. That's really important for CSOs as well. And this week, just on the 4th of June in DFID offices, there's a technical and policy meetings of the civil society groupings involved in SUN are coming together to share their experiences. So again, it's sharing experiences, it's accountability, it's learning from each other. So I think there's real progress in this area. When you come down to individual countries, there are some very interesting examples. I mean, the fact that Malawi has played such an important role, co-chairs the global panel. Not the global panel, the report is one such example, and just a very brief examples of what's happening in Malawi, for example. There's something called the Civil Society Organization Nutrition Alliance, SONA, and what it and its members have been involved in a review of national nutrition policy as well as drafting a Nutrition Act. And 5 SONA members have got a grant from the World Bank to facilitate the implementation of a national education and community strategy in 7 districts. And Save the Children are leading a budget analysis as to how nutrition fits into Malawi's budget. So there's a lot of things happening, and I think we have to very much build on that and keep the momentum.
Thank you, Tom. Elizabeth, I'm going to turn to you now. You represent in this panel really the research community, the African Public Health Research Council, and that community has got a particularly important role in delivering improved nutrition agenda and the evidence for it. I'd like to ask you if you wanted to share some thoughts about the role of research and perhaps your own insights on nutrition as an urban as well as a rural issue.
Thank you, Jeff. We've been working a lot on issues of urbanization and child health outcomes, and particularly for this particular panel, I'm talking about nutrition. So we've done a lot of work around nutrition, and we found that their nutritional status amongst children in urban areas is actually, it's very poor compared to even rural areas. For example, like in Kenya, we are talking of the whole of Kenya, we have 35% of children are stunted, but we find that in the slums, in the slums of Nairobi, about over 40% are stunted. So we found that actually the issue of nutrition is no longer a rural issue, but it's actually also an urban issue because of the issue of urbanization, the rapid urbanization which has been happening in sub-Saharan African countries, including Kenya, and where we don't have services amongst in the urban areas. We don't have proper services. So our work has been research and exposing what's happening in urban areas to the government and other policy makers and decision makers. So we've worked very closely with the government, telling them about what our research has found, and also trying to test interventions that would address these poor nutritional outcomes. For example, we also found that feeding practices are very poor. Like, we talk of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and only like in the urban slums, we have only 2% of children being exclusively breastfed. So the kind of interventions we are trying out, for example, to do with the breastfeeding, some of the when we did qualitative, we've done a lot of qualitative work, and we found that women actually have misperceptions about breastfeeding and how the milk production happens, and they say that because they are poor, they don't have food, they actually don't have milk to breastfeed, so they don't breastfeed adequately. So we've started and there is also an issue of childcare practices where women have to work, to start working very early after giving birth, because they don't have other sources of livelihood. They have to start to go to work almost immediately after birth, and so they don't have they can't exclusively breastfeed, and they don't breastfeed for long because of such issues. So we are trying interventions. The first intervention that we are trying out at the moment is having community health workers counsel mothers around breastfeeding, and supporting them during the time of pregnancy and after birth, to see how that improves their infant feeding practices and nutritional outcomes of children. And also we are trying to see, because the issue of women having to go back to work and leaving their children in some substandard healthcare care centers, we also are trying interventions where we want to see whether if you have standard, you improve the status of the child care centers, that would improve on the nutritional status of children. We also want to try other interventions, like we are thinking of maybe things like if you have income generating activities that would allow mothers to breastfeed as they work, whether that could improve the nutritional status of children. So our role has been to actually, because we know the kind of outcomes which are in the urban poor settings, we want to see what interventions can be put in place, and we are working with the government so that they buy into these the results, and they can also like scale up some of those interventions that we are coming up with.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now, lastly and not leastly, Arti, we've been talking several times during this meeting about advances in India. Your province of Odisha has shown improvements in child nutrition indicators over the past decade, a notable acceleration, particularly in nutrition of children from socially excluded groups. So I thought perhaps you might be able to finish off our panel comments with some impressions of how that's been achieved, and also your impressions of how what you've heard so far this evening is relevant to the kinds of challenges that you face in Odisha.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad you mentioned lastly and not leastly, because one of my professors used to say, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the implementer is often the nail on which different things are being hammered. And let me tell you a bit about what I do. Odisha is one of the backward states of India, had very high levels of undernutrition, but has shown significant reduction. There have been a number of independent evaluations. We've had social audits, a number of studies which are pan-national and which have shown that there are reductions in stunting as well as undernutrition. I head a department that implements integrated child development services, where we provide supplementary nutrition to about 5 million children across 71,000 centers throughout the state. Every day, we give them a hot cooked meal and a morning snack. Also take home ration for children that are below 3 years, pregnant and lactating women, plus a host of other things like nutrition, health education, and also preschool education. So I'm going to broadly tell you about what we did in Odisha, which I suppose should have worked. The first is system strengthening, because we have a very large base of workers. So system strengthening through increased monitoring, building stronger monitoring and evaluation systems, lot of capacity building in the system, lot of IT-related feedbacks, etc. The second thing is what you mentioned about equity. A lot of evidence suggests that there is a very strong socioeconomic gradient in nutrition. And we have something called the Nutrition Operation Plan, which is funded by the DFID. Apart from that, a number of initiatives, especially for, now we are starting for like the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, which are the most primitive and have very bad indicators. So a lot of focus on equity, and all the data suggests that the uptake of services has been much, much higher in the scheduled tribes, especially in the women, as compared to the general category, which is very heartening. The third initiative is involving communities, because as you can guess, centrally monitoring 71,000 centers on a given day is simply not possible. So people in the village have become our best resources in terms of being the eyes and ears. And they are now involved in the whole issue of nutrition. There are incentives for communities. There are different kinds of initiatives they are taking. And there are mothers groups, there are self-help groups of women. And recently we've started doing a PLA with them, which is again based on evidence. There was a Lancet study which showed how effective it was when you work with women's groups. So that's something we've started. So a lot of community involvement. The next is tackling the 1,000 days, which we have been talking about, because as we all know, after 2 years, it's really not much effective if you give all these interventions. So we are doing that 1,000-day approach, and there's been a huge conditional cash transfer program that's been started in Odisha. We give about 5,000 rupees to each woman starting from the first trimester till the baby is a year old. It's not 1,000 days strictly, and we really need to go beyond that 1 year, and which we are hoping we should be able to. But it's, and the initial data, it's just been about 2 years since it was launched, and initial analysis shows that the process indicators for which we are giving, the conditions for which we are doing the cash transfers, they have had significant improvements, which cover the whole gamut of things like early initiation of breastfeeding, antenatal, postnatal care, IFA tablets, etc., etc. And the last thing, the fifth thing, is of course advocacy and convergence, because without that, most of the gains would not be possible. So we have a nutrition council that's headed by the chief minister of the state, where we have all the departments, and it is our job, my department's job, to push for the agenda that we have and achieve the convergence across different departments. And now we are thinking of setting up a secretariat for that mission, which is able to coordinate between different departments based on the evidence and push for the commitments made by the departments. So that's the next step we are going to do. And we are also doing a nutrition mapping across different departments of the government to see which are the interventions that they're doing and where are the gaps, so that that forms a framework for our nutrition policy that we plan to come out with, and also for the secretariat that I just mentioned to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you, panel, for your comments. And I'm going to ask you to stay in your seats while I introduce a final and very welcome speaker today, and then we'll proceed to discussion. I'm very pleased to invite His Excellency Roberto Jaguaribe, the Ambassador of Brazil to the UK government, to join us now and give us a few words on Brazil's experience in tackling undernutrition and also its plans for Rio in 2016. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Of course, as Sir John Beddington said, that even a chief scientist is a little scared of facing an audience in relation to certain scientific issues. What is the gap between my knowledge as an ambassador and the technical requirements for this discussion? But the thing is that one of the things I want to point out essentially is that nutrition is not just a technical issue. In fact, it is essentially a political issue and a diplomatic one. And it needs that approach in order to be overcome and superseded. We, of course, were delighted when the British government invited Brazil to be a partner in this process. We were very laudable action, and I agree with one of the speakers that had attributed a lot of responsibility for the British government in this respect. I think it's quite correct to do so. I think it's a wonderful initiative. And as always, the British government has an enormous convening capacity of strength, which is very important for efforts of this nature. So we are very happy in this initiative. I must say, we're a little concerned that it would be excessively narrow in its focus. Brazil has a vision that nutrition is a developmental problem. It has to be perceived in a broad vision, otherwise we're not going to supersede it. It's not because of a magic pill that's going to be developed somewhere that we are going to solve the nutritional issue. It has to be seen in a very broad developmental approach. And we wanted to pursue this line, and sometimes we thought that this would not be the final. And I was, for instance, listening today that said that food is not the solution to nutrition entirely, but we do think it is helpful. and in this vision that we should strive for further agricultural production, this brings into light an enormity of problems that have not even been pointed out, like agricultural subsidies, trade, and a number of other elements that are fundamental in sorting out this issue on a global scale. On the other hand, we're happy to say, and perhaps is a little bit more optimistic, so are you going to wait for the conclusion of the Doha round in order to be able to tackle nutrition? That's not necessary at all. There are several different ways of doing it, and I think many of the processes that have been developed are very useful in this respect. Brazil has had an enormous priority attributed to this issue over the past many decades. We have been very successful in tackling many of these issues. But we've seen this as a holistic manner, a broad developmental issue that requires all elements to be approached and tackled. And I think we have been very successful. We began with a program which has been established in a small community, not so small actually, the capital of the Republic, but at a local level, which was the school meal approach many, many years ago. And this has developed into a major program for Brazil, satisfying tens of millions of school kids 3 times a day on a regular basis. Then we have a very well-known program called Bolsa Familia, which is also very helpful and contributes significantly to this process. All of this making significant advances in this case in Brazil. On the other hand, we are also looking very much towards other countries that have the same requirements and have established many programs of cooperation within Latin America, but very especially with Africa. And this again is where Nutrition for Growth can play a very significant role. We have had many meetings with UK. We have agreed on a number of major areas where we're going to assess this issue and tackle it together. We are also very enthusiastic about the idea that we should try to garner as much support and visibility worldwide as possible. And obviously, major sporting events are extremely helpful in this respect. And the idea to connect this with the London Olympics was very well perceived. And we are very glad to say that obviously we're going to host the event in 2016 in Brazil. But the basic understandings with UK is that we're focusing on three main pillars. The first is research on nutrition itself, promoting a new research initiatives and linkages between universities in different regions. In the case of Latin America, our Ministry of Science and Technology has established a network of 37 institutions in the region, and we are already incorporating 5 new African research agencies as well. As you all may know, we have established a branch of our Agricultural Research Agency in Africa, and our agency has had enormous success in tackling tropical agricultural challenges, which are to a large extent replicable in Africa, and we're trying to do that. In fact, many of you here, including the Bill Gates Foundation, are helping and supporting Brazilian initiatives in this respect in Africa as well. Of course, this is a very important element. The political element is fundamental. So the second level is a network of parliamentarians and magistrates. It's an ongoing process which began in FAO in 2006. And it's already, the idea is to promote food and nutritional security within national legislative structures so as to strengthen the political internal commitments for that process in countries, and this we believe is a fundamental element. And the third is fighting food inflation and promoting healthy eating. And the main issues here are education on healthy and nutritious foods and promoting access. Unfortunately, where currently the most work needs to be done. On the positive side, Brazil has already a number of initiatives in this respect which have been very useful. And I think the revolution in agriculture is something that we expect from Africa. And this is not just a question of science, but it's a question also of a business model. In Brazil, we have developed a very sound business model, both for large-scale farming and for probably what is more important for Africa at this stage, for family farming. And this includes, of course, distribution, getting the products to markets and all of these elements. And we're working together with a number of entities trying to make sure that the models that have been successful in Brazil, and in this I think we are very well situated because the challenges are not very different from what many of the countries in Africa face. And of course, the developmental requirements in Brazil are still enormous. In fact, the fact that we have been growing and superseded a number of problems does not make them they have not gone away. They're still present in Brazil. So our experience in this respect are very useful, and I think they could be shared. So essentially, just to conclude, we are very happy to be associated with this initiative. We look forward for all the developments, and we think that this partnership has all the elements to be one of the elements together embodied in the global processes of superseding major developmental problems, especially the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now being formatted, and where I think there can be a major commitment, and the results can be very successful. And to a large extent, we can see that the Millennium Development Goals have already contributed significantly to overcoming a number of major developmental problems. Of course, not all, and certainly not to the extent desirable. But I think this process has gained momentum, and the Nutrition for Go initiative is contributing in this respect as well. Thank you. Could I sit here? Very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. We now have about a quarter of an hour for questions before the end of our session, which means we're going to have to be quite succinct because I think there are probably a lot of questions out there. I'll be inviting them from the audience, from Twitter feeds, and I think what the best thing to do is to collect a few questions and then direct them to the panel. Now, one of the things that won't work is if every panel member answers every question all the way down the line. So I'm going to, if your question isn't directed at a particular panel member, I'm going to ask for a volunteer, but not share the question across so we can get more questions in. So please, questions from the audience. One up here first. I'll collect a few. Please. Could you say who you are and then follow with a succinct question, please?
Hi, I'm Marie Rumsby from Save the Children. So accountability has come up a number of times this evening as being key. We've also heard that there are several different initiatives working to address malnutrition, such as Nutrition for Growth, ICN2, post-2015. How can we ensure that these accountability efforts are harmonised so that we can effectively monitor progress? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Saw a hand up over here. Yes, Barry.
Barry Popkin.
Wait, there's a mic coming.
Excuse me, Barry Popkin, University of North Carolina.
Shout.
Shout. Okay, so this is for our DFID map. So in India, which is the center of half of our global stunting and wasting, we've had a 2-year or so major public works program before the elections. That's going to end with the new president. How are we going to deal with, on the national level, with getting them to continue with this kind of huge income generation in the rural areas, which even stopped rural migrant labor going from places like Orissa to, in Assam to the Punjab?
And one more. Down here, please.
Thank you. My name's Steve Lewis. I work for Results, and we took some parliamentarians to Cambodia and have just written this report, Undernutrition in Cambodia. So it's one of those sort of forgotten small countries. It's not like India, it's not Nigeria, but it's a typical country where there is good economic growth, and yet undernutrition rates are very stable. We're still, just like the example Michael gave about Zambia, we're talking 45% stunted children, and yet economic growth is 7% a year and so on. So the stakeholders in Cambodia asked me, they said, well, what new programs are coming out of Nutrition for Growth? So the concrete question for Nick and for Michael, actually, a year ago, I think we announced something called the Matching Fund for DFID and the Catalytic Fund. So the question is, when are more details going to come out from these about what will be the mechanisms and what will be the arrangements for those new funding lines? Thank you.
Great, so let's take some answers to those. We started with a general accountability question. Several different institutions are involved in this. Nutrition for Growth is just one initiative. How are we going to guarantee accountability across those? And then some specific ones on India that was directed to Nick, but I think Arti might want to have a comment on that as well. And one on Cambodia directed to Nick and Michael about the catalytic and matching funds. So perhaps I could start with, who'd like to start? Nick, would you like to start?
Okay, let me half answer the India question, and maybe others got a contribution to it. I mean, certainly the answer isn't that the UK government will fund it, and I think this is exactly the reason why we need to have accountability and advocacy, because this is a political issue. This is about the politicians in India deciding how to allocate their resources, and this is about people in India highlighting the importance of nutrition as one of those issues that they want to see funded. And that's exactly why we need the accountability reports. That's why we need to highlight what the state of the nutritional status is in India, to bring pressure on the politicians and to get people to highlight the issue. So I think it's entirely I think the accountability and the advocacy has got to be a big part of this.
On the catalytic and matching funds, anything to comment on that before we move on to Arti? Or?
You want to say anything about catalytic and matching?
Catalytic matching funds. The UK government set out, was it 250 odd million pounds as a matching fund on a 1-to-1 and a 2-to-1 basis. And we are working with a number of people, including CIFF, including the Canadian government and others, to try and unlock that resource. The worst thing would be that we don't unlock it, that we don't take advantage of the funding. So it's about finding opportunities and talking to those who are bringing new money to the table and encouraging those bring new money to the table to try and unlock that. So we're very much in the market to do that.
Michael, do you have a comment on that?
Sorry, should I talk about that and then hand over to Arti
to
give us the answer on India? So on the catalytic fund, which CIFF is heavily involved in, we are spent a lot of time in the last year doing design work and now well advanced in putting together the program with the World Bank as the anchor distributor. But the idea of the catalytic fund is to bring in new money, to match it with some existing donors, and to help leverage and mobilize the funds that are available through the World Bank, but also at the domestic level. I think the single most important thing to keep an eye on, we've kind of calculated that our resources, CIFF's resources, would be on the order of 2% of the total of what is needed to address the stunting challenge as set up with WHA. So all the donors together, CIFF plus Gates plus DFID plus World Bank, is only a small percentage of what is needed. So the big answer is political mobilization and getting the domestic resources mobilized in the right way. And I think that is a perfect point to hand over to Arti, who's shown great leadership in making sure that happens.
Thank you. To answer your question, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme may not be watered down. It might be restructured, but we can't say. But the good news is that the National Food Security Act is already enacted, which provides for right to food, minimum basic entitlements, so that's going to stay. And the new government has already demonstrated or stated its commitment to nutrition. And I think in the coming days, we are going to see a lot more action on that front.
Can I just add a word on the accountability, Jeff? Because I know that the Sun Civil Society Network is actively engaged in looking at this, looking at some of the commitments made under Nutrition for Growth last year. They're also looking at what CS themselves have made commitments to and what have been delivered against those commitments. I think the critical thing, as always, is that if this information is collected, it's put out there in the public arena so that we know what we can compare. And I mean, given some of the large commitments that were made last year by governments, I think, you know, we all of us have a responsibility to deal with specific governments and ask how they have lived up to what they've promised.
Thanks. Now, I'd like to hold that accountability question for the panel and collect a few more, and then let everybody come back to that, because I think that's a big question. I'll take 2 more questions. I've got a Twitter question as well. So move around the room. Up here in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Robin from the University of Sydney, and 2 disclaimers. I was born and raised on a beef and sheep farm, and I'm a veterinarian by training. So one of the things that really interests me when I listen to the public health nutrition discussions is that nobody really talks about diet and ideal composition. When I go around, people don't really understand what they should be eating. People don't seem to understand the difference between what men and women should eat. So my question is, I think we have to start with ourselves and that level of understanding. If people making decisions understood what a good diet is, maybe that would be better. So I'd really just love to hear your thoughts on how we improve our own understanding to deal with under and over obesity. Thank you.
Thank you. And a question way up at the back there.
Thank you. I'm Sabrina from Results UK. My question is, or a comment really, is 4.1 billion is a completely amazing amount of money to be pledged, and just want to encourage that money is dispersed quickly and effectively, because we have some really impressive impact targets, and obviously the quicker that money is dispersed, the larger impact we're going to have. But I think we also need to recognise that 4.1 billion is a great start, but it's still just a start. The Lancet series stated that it's going to take 9.6 billion a year, and it's 4.1 billion over 7 years. So we obviously have the 2016 Rio. Do we see this as a moment for repledging and further commitments? Because we've talked a lot about momentum, and that is an opportunity for momentum financially and politically as well.
Okay, thanks. So we'll get a question. Can we go down a couple rows to the question here, and then pick up one more, and then from here, and we'll. So can you reach in, Charlotte?
Thank you very much. I'm Charlotte Dufour. I work with the Food and Agriculture Organization Nutrition Division, and my question is for His Excellency Mr. Jaguaribe. I would like to say, on one hand, the agriculture sector obviously has a big role to play, but has been a little bit behind in taking ownership of the nutrition agenda. And while I must say it might not be visible from the outside yet, I'm seeing a lot of change amongst colleagues, agronomists, economists. It is taking time, and it is really, we see a growing number of countries where ministries of agriculture are slowly starting to look into nutrition, but it's hard, number one, and it's often very much still perceived as a donor-driven agenda. And so my question would be, how has that been the experience in Brazil, since you have a good example of, I think, ownership from a variety of ministries? What might be the levers, what might be the advocacy points we can use to build that momentum in agriculture? And I'd also please let's keep this momentum going long enough that the ownership can be strong enough to really sustain change. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question I'll take off of one of our Twitter responses, and it goes like this. Are there new ways to making nutrition more visible politically in Brazil and other countries? Okay, are there new ways for making nutrition more visibly in Brazil, visible politically in Brazil and other countries? So we have a number of questions about understanding diet, about the particular experiences of Brazil, and more generally the whole opportunity to get ministries engaged in agriculture, and also about making nutrition more visible politically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by asking the ambassador to answer the question, and then open it to any comments that our panel might want to make, because that's probably going to be near our last round of questions. So please.
Well, thank you. You know, this is a fundamental question, obviously. We in Brazil, and I think everybody, believes that the only sustainable changes come from within. And if you're not going to have a different model through aid alone, that is a important component to start the model off. But the only sustainable thing is changes from within. For that, you need good practices and commitment. I think Brazil has provided some attractive models that can be used in countries with similar challenges, both from the technical point of view, from the social point of view, and from the political point of view, because these elements have to be taken into account if you're going to find sustainable solutions. And they need societal and model changes, which are not easy to undertake. Just a slight criticism here, if you allow me. We think that some of the aid models have been too much geared with what we call the perceptive role, political perceptive role, which we don't feel is helpful. We think they are not contributing to effective change internally in the countries where it's required. In many African countries, you cannot talk about good governance. You don't have the conditions for good governance. You need to start generating some capacity, especially in agriculture first. And of course, you have this something that comes along, but it is not a simple issue. But as I said, I think it needs to be done from within. I think many entities understand this well, and that is why, to a large extent, Brazil has been requested to participate, because it can help the model that we utilize to be more further down.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Anybody else like to comment? Everybody has an opportunity now in this last round.
Well, I just, and then I'll finish, obviously. I mean, I do think we're back to how to build support politically is a crucial issue in the year that we're facing, because next September 2015, really important decisions are going to be taken, which about the post-2015 world, which are going to determine policies for a number of years to come at national and international and national level. So I think it's up to this community in this room to muster all the arguments that the compelling arguments that there are, the arguments of science, the critical importance of investing in early childhood nutrition, the benefit that brings to human beings, to societies and to economies, and keep hammering home that message. And you know, this is a time critical moment for that message, for all of us to resolve that we're going to do whatever we can to influence whoever we can to make sure that that message gets embedded in policy in post-2015.
Thank you. So politics and accountability. Joe, would you like to say something?
I think that summed it up pretty nicely. I mean, I would say that you've got the underpinnings of something very unique here. One is just the agreed to policies that we know, and the targets that were set, and I think carefully laid out. I think the political underpinnings as well, the support demonstrated in 2013 for this issue is something that definitely can be continued to be tapped into. I think there is a next step, which is the popular engagement on this issue, and the more that some of the success stories, we've heard some fantastic successes and the ability to really scale simple interventions. I agree with Michael's point about the fact that we really need implementation and people to really put their muscle into making this happen. But the more we can accentuate some of the success stories that are possible, I think is critical. And 2016 is a fantastic moment to, I think, bring that together. So, you know, how we do that and how we sort of capture that creativity, I think is something really important to build on with those other elements, on the policy, on the politics, and some of the specific targets.
Thank you. Other final comments?
Okay. I just wanted to capture Robin's point about diet and remembering to kind of keep that important and forefront, and connecting to Charlotte's point about the food community probably hasn't come as quickly forward on this as it needs to, and I think that we're just on the cusp of really making that happen. I think that connects with the ambassador's point quite nicely about building political commitment around the agriculture base and developing that. I do agree with Tom that the next year is getting those political arguments out clearly with a clear accountability framework. The question of how to bring the accountability all together of these various entities, we really hope that the report that Lawrence and Srinath and others are going to be leading on is going to pull together a lot of these disparate elements. And that's going to include, by the way, tracking the performance of the CSOs as well as the governments and various entities. So I think the accountability is critical, absolutely critical to raising awareness, driving forward accountability. And 2016 in Brazil is a critical moment for all of us. The question about can we get some more pledging, I think we're all looking to the government of Brazil to really lead us powerfully into a moment when we take this to a next level, based on the terrific experience that Brazil has to share with the rest of the world. So I think the next year leading up to the 2015 goals and the 2016 moment, a lot to do, but lots of tools which we know that work, and that's a good place to be.
Thank you. Anybody else like to make some final comments?
On Sabrina's point about it's not enough, the resources, absolutely it's not enough. But aid money is not going to fix it. And if you put the entire DFID budget, UK government budget into it, it wouldn't fix it. But I think that the point of the event last year was twofold. One was to raise the profile of the issue and get some momentum and political support behind it. But the other was to do it in a way to demonstrate that actually the solution is by engaging the science community. It's about learning from countries like Brazil. It is about unlocking the private sector. It is about getting governments to stand up and provide their own domestic resources to this issue. So it's not just an aid issue. We've got to collectively make the effort. And I mean, if you want to know where the UK government is, we've issued this Nutrition for Growth 1 year on little report here, which is our accountability in terms of what we've done. So have a look at that. But somebody asked a question about how do you change the politics. In some respects, I mean, I'm the last person you should ask in terms of how do we unlock the power of information. But ask my 17-year-old daughter, who will tell you what you have to do in terms of reaching new people through social media and using information in a different way to bring it to life and get it more accessed. And that's what we've got to start looking at as well. Not the good old standard reports that go straight on the shelf, but how can we get real-time information delivered in a compelling way that will grab people's attention.
Thank you. Great. Well, that's what we have time for in the way of questions tonight. Thank you for those. If there are more questions, we do have refreshments afterwards. I hope you'll nobble some of our speakers and do that. I'd like to thank our speakers, our panel, Ambassador, John, Lawrence, Srinath, for their presentations this evening. I think you'll agree they were all very, very direct and very influential in our thinking about how nutrition goes forward. So a round of applause. Thank you all. There is a momentum. Nutrition for Growth is alive. It's moving forward. We see some hills in the horizon. We see some big tasks in 2015 with the post-2015 agenda, 2016 when that race will hand the baton over to Brazil. Good luck to us all with that. I hope we'll have some very exciting reports on nutrition and other outcomes from Nutrition for Growth to help with that important political activity, and always the need to look at accountability as we go. So thank you for coming this evening. Do join us downstairs, and look forward to our discussions there.